The crystal tumbler hit the marble table harder than intended. Robert Sullivan didn't bother looking up when the waiter approached another face in a sea of people who couldn't solve his problem. $12 million had just walked out because he couldn't bridge a cultural gap, and his frustration needed a target. "I'll give you $100,000 if you can serve me in Japanese," he said, the words dripping with sarcasm he didn't bother to hide. The silence that followed made him finally look up. The man standing there, worn uniform, calloused hands, wedding ring catching the dim light, smiled quietly before responding in flawless Kyoto dialect. "Kashikomarimashita. It seems you've had a difficult evening, sir." Sullivan's breath caught. Those 9 languages this man carried weren't just skills learned in classrooms. They were love letters written in grief, promises kept to someone who was no longer there to hear them. The Riverside Grill had always been Robert Sullivan's sanctuary when deals went south. Its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers represented everything he'd built over 20 years' success, measured in square footage and quarterly returns. Tonight, the restaurant felt different. The usual comfort of leather booths and ambient jazz couldn't penetrate the armor of his frustration. Even the familiar weight of a $200 scotch couldn't wash away the bitter taste of failure. Sullivan had arrived at this moment through decades of calculated risks and ruthless decisions. He'd started with nothing, a studio apartment in Queens, a business degree from a state school, and an unshakable belief that he deserved more. By 30, he'd flipped his first company for 7 figures. By 35, he was managing a portfolio that made his former classmates whisper his name with equal parts admiration and envy. By 40, Robert Sullivan had become the kind of man who wore custom Italian suits like armor and treated every interaction as a negotiation to win. He'd walked into that conference room 3 hours ago with projections that would make any investor salivate. The numbers didn't lie. Tanaka Corporation should have signed on the spot. Sullivan had spent weeks preparing, running scenarios with his team, anticipating every possible objection. The presentation had been flawless, sleek slides, compelling data, a vision so clear it practically sold itself. But something had gone wrong. Hiroshi Tanaka had grown increasingly distant as the presentation progressed. The interpreter had translated every word correctly. Sullivan was certain of that. But something essential had been lost. The formal politeness had remained, but the warmth had drained from Tanaka's eyes. Sullivan had watched it happen in real time, like watching stock prices plummet, powerless to stop the slide. By the time they'd reached the projected revenue streams, Sullivan could feel the deal slipping away like sand through his fingers. The meeting had ended with the Japanese executive's promise to consider the proposal carefully, business language for a polite no wrapped in diplomatic paper. Tanaka had bowed with perfect courtesy, his face an impenetrable mask, and walked out with his entire team following in synchronized silence. Sullivan had stood there in the conference room, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, staring at his presentation on the screen. Every data point was correct. Every projection was conservative. Every assumption was backed by market research, and yet he'd failed completely. The failure burned differently than his usual setbacks. Sullivan was used to competition, to being outbid or outmaneuvered. Those losses stung his pride but made sense within the rules of engagement he understood. This was something else entirely. He'd lost not because his ideas weren't good enough, but because he couldn't connect, couldn't make them see what he saw, couldn't bridge a gap he hadn't even known existed until it swallowed his deal whole. Now he sat in his booth at the Riverside Grill, loosening his silk tie with a gesture more violent than necessary. 42 years old, and he'd never felt more inadequate. He'd survived the 2008 crash when bigger firms had crumbled around him like sand castles at high tide. He'd outmaneuvered competitors with twice his resources and 3 times his connections. He'd built an empire on the foundation of being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else in the room. But tonight, language and culture had defeated him more completely than any market downturn ever could. And the worst part? He didn't even understand how it had happened. The failure was invisible, untraceable, like fighting fog. Sullivan took a long drink, welcoming the burn. Around him, the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of people who belonged to his world tech executives, venture capitalists, old money in new restaurants. Everyone here spoke the same language of success, wore the same uniform of expensive casualness, performed the same rituals of dominance disguised as networking. He'd never felt more alone. The waiter materialized beside his booth with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to read a room's temperature. His name tag read Michael Carter, and despite the late hour, his posture remained straight, professional. But his eyes carried something deeper than fatigue, the kind of weariness that came not from long shifts but from carrying weight invisible to others. Sullivan barely glanced at him. In his world, service workers were part of the scenery, as interchangeable as the chairs they set and the plates they carried. He'd never been deliberately cruel to them, but he'd never really seen them either. They were functions, not people. Mechanisms in the machine of his comfort. "Evening, sir. Can I start you with something to drink?" The uniform Michael wore had been pressed carefully, but the fabric showed its age in ways that spoke of many washings, many shifts, many years of service. His hands bore calluses that had nothing to do with carrying trays. These were the hands of someone who'd worked with tools, with soil, with the kind of manual labor that left permanent marks. Sullivan waved dismissively at the menu without really looking at it or at Michael. "Whatever. Just bring me your most expensive whiskey." He paused, then added with bitter humor, "Unless you speak Japanese. Then I'll give you $100,000 to serve me in Japanese for the evening." The words came out sharper than he'd intended, but he was past caring. It was supposed to be a joke, a way to mock his own inadequacy while taking a small piece of power back. See? He could laugh at himself. He could admit defeat. As long as he was the one telling the story, he was still in control. Michael didn't flinch at the rudeness. Instead, something flickered across his face recognition, or perhaps memory. His expression shifted in a way Sullivan would later remember as the moment everything changed, though he didn't recognize it at the time. When Michael spoke, the words flowed like water over river stones, each syllable crisp and perfectly formed in Japanese. "Kashikomarimashita. Osake no omenu wo omochi shimasu. Konban wa nani ka tsurai koto ga atta yu desu ne." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Sullivan's head snapped up so fast his neck cracked audibly. The Japanese wasn't just correct, it was flawless. Not textbook perfection, but the natural fluency that only came from living the language, from breathing it until it became second nature. Michael had said he understood, would bring the drink menu, and had observed with genuine empathy that Sullivan seemed to be having a difficult evening. For a long moment, Sullivan could only stare. His brain struggled to reconcile what he'd just heard with the man standing before him, the worn uniform, the calloused hands, the name tag that said Michael Carter in plain English letters. This didn't make sense. People like this didn't speak perfect Japanese. Hell, Sullivan had just lost a $12 million deal specifically because he couldn't find people who spoke Japanese well enough to bridge cultural gaps. Where did you learn to speak like that?" Sullivan's voice had lost its edge, replaced by genuine surprise that bordered on disbelief. The question came out almost accusatory, as if Michael had somehow cheated by possessing skills that didn't match Sullivan's assumptions. Michael smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Not the professional smile of service industry training. Sullivan had seen enough of those to recognize the difference, but something real and painful and achingly human. "I lived in Kyoto for 11 months, he said simply, switching back to English. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone used to telling a story that hurt. "My wife always wanted to see the cherry blossoms at Maruyama Park." The past tense hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with meaning Sullivan almost didn't want to understand. "Wanted?" Sullivan heard himself ask, his business disaster momentarily forgotten. Something in Michael's expression made him suddenly aware that he'd stumbled into territory far more significant than a lost deal. She passed away 3 years ago. Michael's voice remained steady, even as his hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his order pad. Cancer. Stage 3. We knew she had maybe 3-4 years when they diagnosed her. He paused, and in that pause, Sullivan heard entire universes of grief compressed into silence. So we made a promise. She'd always dreamed of traveling, seeing the world beyond our little town in Ohio. And I'd always been good with languages, picked them up easy as a kid. Sullivan found himself leaning forward, his own problems suddenly feeling very small and distant, like looking at his life through the wrong end of a telescope. So you just went? Michael glanced around the restaurant, then seemed to make a decision. He pulled out a chair technically against policy, Sullivan would later learn, but somehow neither of them cared in that moment. Not just went. I quit my job at the travel agency, sold everything we owned except what fit in 2 backpacks. His laugh was soft, tinged with the kind of nostalgia that comes from remembering a person rather than a time. Jennifer thought I was crazy at first. We had a house, stable jobs, a life that made sense on paper. But sense doesn't matter much when the person you love has an expiration date. The story spilled out in the quiet booth, and Sullivan found himself listening with an intensity he usually reserved for financial reports and market analysis. Michael spoke of learning Japanese first because that was Jennifer's #1 destination. He'd started with apps and online courses while they were still in Ohio, studying at midnight while Jennifer slept fitfully beside him, her body waging a war against itself that medicine could only slow, never stop. The learning had been brutal at first. Japanese wasn't like the Spanish he'd picked up in high school or the French he'd dabbled in during college. The 3 writing systems alone had made him want to quit a dozen times, but every time he felt like giving up, he'd look at Jennifer sleeping, her face peaceful in ways it never was during waking hours, and he'd return to his conjugation tables and vocabulary lists. By the time they'd saved enough to leave liquidating their 401 KS, selling their modest house to a young couple who reminded Michael painfully of who he and Jennifer had been 5 years earlier, he could hold basic conversations. Not fluently, but enough to order food, ask directions, apologize when he inevitably screwed up cultural protocols he didn't yet understand. The real learning came from immersion. Michael had found work washing dishes at a small restaurant in Shibuya, living in a tiny room above the kitchen that barely fit their 2 backpacks and a futon. The heat in summer had been suffocating, and the winter cold had seeped through walls, thin as paper. But the family who ran the restaurant had adopted them in the way of people who recognized something precious when they saw it, a man learning their language out of love for a woman who was dying. They'd corrected his grammar patiently, taught him not just words but the subtle gradations of politeness that made Japanese as much about relationship as communication. The grandmother, Keiko-san, had taken special interest in Jennifer, bringing her special teas for the nausea and sitting with her on days when Michael worked double shifts to afford Jennifer's medications. We spent 7 months in Japan, Michael continued, his eyes distant with memory. Jennifer wanted to see everything: the temples in Kyoto, the deer in Nara, the snow monkeys in Nagano. We took the bullet train to Hiroshima and stood in front of the Peace Memorial, and she cried because the world was so full of both terrible beauty and beautiful terror, and she was so angry she wouldn't have more time to experience it all. His voice caught slightly, then steadied. On her bad days, when the medication made her too sick to leave our room, I'd go out alone to the fish market at dawn, to the gardens where monks raked gravel into patterns that looked like frozen water, to the shrines where people wrote wishes on wooden plaques, and then I'd come back and describe everything to her, and she'd close her eyes and imagine them. Sometimes that felt like enough. Sometimes it felt like the cruelest thing in the world, that she could only experience life secondhand. Sullivan realized his whiskey sat untouched, forgotten. He was completely absorbed in this story, in this man he'd dismissed as scenery just 10 minutes earlier. But 7 months wasn't enough, he said, understanding somehow where this was going. No. Michael's smile was sad and beautiful and broke Sullivan's heart in ways he didn't have words for. Jennifer had other dreams, so we moved on. They'd gone to Italy next, to Florence and Venice and the Amalfi Coast. Michael had learned Italian on the overnight train from Rome to Florence, his head bent over language books while Jennifer slept against his shoulder, her breath rattling in ways that made him want to scream at the universe. In Venice, they'd gotten hopelessly lost in the maze of canals, and Jennifer had laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in weeks, declaring that if she was going to be lost, Venice was a pretty good place for it. From Italy to France, where Michael's high school French came back faster than expected, muscle memory in his mouth and tongue. Paris had been everything Jennifer dreamed and nothing she expected. She'd stood in front of the Mona Lisa and been disappointed by how small it was, then spent 2 hours in a corner of the Louvre crying at a painting of the Virgin Mary because something about the mother's expression had reached inside her chest and squeezed. They'd gone to Brazil next, to Rio, where Michael learned Portuguese from a host family who'd lost their own daughter to leukemia and recognized in Jennifer something of her spirit. They'd watched sunset from Christ the Redeemer, Jennifer wrapped in blankets despite the heat because the cancer was stealing her ability to regulate her own temperature. And she'd said it felt like being held by something larger than pain. Germany, where Michael's natural ear for language helped him navigate the harsh consonants and compound words. Spain, where flamenco music had made Jennifer cry and Spanish guitar had made her smile. China, where learning Mandarin had nearly broken him, the tonal complexity like trying to hear music he didn't have the ears for. But he'd persisted, driven by Jennifer's determination to see the Great Wall, to stand on something built to last centuries and feel her own mortality in contrast. Morocco had been spices and calls to prayer and getting lost in the Medina of Marrakesh. Michael had picked up enough Arabic to navigate markets, to haggle for the silver bracelet Jennifer had wanted, to thank the shopkeeper who'd given them mint tea and refused payment because he'd looked at Jennifer and understood without words being spoken. And finally, India. Michael had learned Hindi from a mix of Bollywood movies watched on trains and conversations with travelers, and the patient instruction of a doctor in Delhi who'd helped them navigate Jennifer's worsening symptoms. Hindi had been beautiful in ways that surprised him, the script like art, the sounds softer than he'd expected. We made it to the Taj Mahal 2 years and 11 months after we left Ohio, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer could barely walk by then. The cancer had spread to her bones, turning her skeleton into a prison of pain, but she insisted on seeing it at sunrise. The guards at first said no, she couldn't enter without walking, but then they looked at her face, and they understood. Michael's eyes were wet now, but his voice remained steady. I carried her the last 100 yards. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. I could feel every bone in her body through her clothes. We sat there together as the sun came up and turned the marble from white to pink to gold. She told me it was perfect, that every single moment of the previous 3 years had been perfect, even the hard parts, because we'd lived them together. He looked down at his hands, at the gold wedding band he still wore, slightly loose now on a finger that had grown thinner from years of hard work. She died 2 months after we got back to the States. We'd accomplished everything on her list. We came home to Ohio because she wanted Grace, our daughter, to have stability after she was gone. She died in a hospital bed in Cleveland, but she died happy. She died having lived more in 3 years than most people do in 80. The silence that followed felt sacred. Sullivan found his throat tight, his eyes burning with tears he hadn't cried in years. His expensive suit suddenly felt like a costume, his lost deal like a child's game compared to what this man had faced and survived. Here he'd been, sulking over $12 million and a bruised ego, while this man, this waiter he'd barely glanced at, had loved someone enough to learn 9 languages, to carry her to the Taj Mahal at sunrise, to keep her memory alive by wearing a wedding ring 3 years after her death. "I've got a daughter," Michael added softly, and something in his voice shifted from grief to fierce, protective love. "Grace. She's 7 now. was 4 when her mom passed. She doesn't remember much about those 3 years of traveling, but she has the photo albums I made her and the stories I tell her every night before bed. His expression grew more complicated. Some nights she asks about her mom, and I tell her about the woman who loved her so much that even dying couldn't make her want to miss a single moment of her life. And some nights Grace just wants to hear about the places we went, the foods we ate, the languages I learned. She's learning Spanish in school now, and she told me last week that when she grows up, she wants to travel like we did. Not because someone's dying, but because the world is beautiful and big and worth seeing. Michael's smile was watery but genuine. I work 3 jobs to give her opportunities. This restaurant 3 nights a week, bookkeeping for a small law firm during the day, and weekend shifts at a garden center. The languages help I do translation work sometimes, Spanish and French mostly. Japanese when someone needs it, though that's rare in Ohio. "What about the others?" Sullivan asked, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to process. "You said 9 languages? Japanese, Italian, French, Portuguese, German, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and Hindi." Michael rattled off. "Some better than others. My Mandarin is rough, and my Arabic is mostly market transactions and pleasantries. But Jennifer wanted to see places where these languages lived, and I wanted to help her experience them fully." Every vocabulary word memorized while holding her hand through chemotherapy. Every grammar rule mastered in the spaces between hospital visits and medication schedules. He pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn photograph protected by a plastic sleeve. In it, a thin woman with a brilliant smile stood in front of the Taj Mahal at sunrise, the marble glowing gold behind her, her eyes alight with joy despite the obvious toll illness had taken on her body. Next to her, a younger Michael supported her weight while trying to hold the camera steady, and his expression was one of such fierce, tender love that Sullivan had to look away. "That's the last photo of her really smiling," Michael said softly. 2 weeks later, we flew home. 6 weeks after that, she was gone. He tucked the photo back in his pocket, close to his heart. But for 2 years and 11 months, she got to live. Really live. And I got to give her that. The languages were my gift to her, my way of making sure she could experience the world fully, could talk to people, could understand the places we visited as more than just tourists passing through. Sullivan sat back, physically and emotionally overwhelmed. His mind was racing, connecting dots he'd never seen before. "I just lost a major deal with a Japanese corporation tonight," he heard himself confess, the admission easier than he'd expected. $12 million. I couldn't connect with them. Couldn't make them understand my vision, even with a professional interpreter. The words were right, but something was missing. Michael nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. Translation gives you words, but connection requires understanding not just language, but context, culture, the 1,000 small things that make communication real instead of just technically correct. My interpreter in Japan could translate everything I said, but Jennifer and I would have missed so much if that's all we'd had. The languages let us connect, let us understand jokes and poetry, and the way people see the world differently depending on the words they use to describe it. How long did it take you? To learn all of them? 3 years, give or take. But I was motivated by something most people don't have. Michael's laugh was soft and sad. Knowing someone you love is dying is a hell of a motivator. Makes you efficient, focused, strips away everything that doesn't matter. I didn't have time to be perfect, but I had to be good enough. Good enough to help Jennifer experience these places, to translate not just for her but with her, to share the journey in every sense. Sullivan felt something crack open inside his chest, some armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it was there. "That's remarkable," he said, and meant it in ways that went beyond admiration into something closer to awe. "You're remarkable." Michael shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm a widower working 3 jobs to give my kid a decent life. I'm barely keeping my head above water most days. The languages are beautiful, but they don't pay the bills. They're souvenirs from the worst and best time of my life. They could pay the bills. The words were out before Sullivan fully thought them through, but once spoken, he recognized their truth. What you have, it's not just language skills. It's cultural understanding, emotional intelligence, the ability to connect with people across barriers that most of us don't even see until we're slamming face first into them. That's exactly what I need, what my company needs. Michael's expression shifted to polite skepticism. Mr. Sullivan. Robert, please. It felt important somehow, that shift from formal to familiar. Robert, Michael amended carefully. I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm a waiter. I don't have business experience, MBA knowledge, corporate skills. I know how to survive foreign countries on a shoestring budget and how to ask where the bathroom is in 9 languages. That's not exactly boardroom material. Bullshit. The curse felt good, cathartic. Sullivan leaned forward, his business mind engaging with a problem that actually mattered for the first time in hours. I've got 100 people with MBAs and corporate skills. What I don't have is someone who can help me actually connect with the international partners I'm trying to work with. Someone who understands that business isn't just about numbers and projections, but about relationships, cultural context, human connection. He thought about Hiroshi Tanaka's face, the way the warmth had drained from his expression during the presentation. I had all the right words tonight. My interpreter was technically perfect, but I couldn't make Tanaka see what I was trying to show him, couldn't bridge the gap between my American directness and his Japanese subtlety. The numbers were right, but the relationship was wrong. Sullivan pulled out his phone, opened his notes app, started typing. I'm serious about this. I'll pay you $75,000 to start. That's gotta be more than you're making across 3 jobs. I'll cover health insurance for you and Grace, full benefits. You'll work as a cultural consultant and liaison. When I have international meetings, you'll be there not just to translate, but to help me navigate the cultural context. To teach me what I'm missing. Robert, I can't. Why not? Sullivan challenged. Give me one good reason that isn't just fear of change. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his order pad. I've built a life for Grace around these 3 jobs. She has routine, stability. After losing her mom, that matters. I can't risk that on something uncertain. What's certain about working 3 jobs? What happens if you get sick? If one of those jobs disappears? Sullivan pressed, then softened his tone. Look, I'm not saying this doesn't come with risk. Everything does. But here's what I can offer. Stability, good pay, a chance to use skills you developed through love for something more than just survival. Jennifer wanted Grace to see that hard things can lead to beautiful things. Isn't that what you'd be teaching her? The mention of Jennifer's name hit Michael visibly. His hand went to his pocket, to the photograph he carried everywhere. She did want that, he admitted softly. She made me promise, in those last weeks, made me promise I wouldn't just survive after she was gone, that I'd actually live, that I'd use everything we'd experienced together to build something good for Grace. Then let me help you keep that promise. Sullivan felt the rightness of this in his bones, the sense that he'd stumbled into something important in ways that transcended business deals and profit margins. I lost $12 million tonight because I couldn't connect with someone from a different culture. But I found something potentially worth more, someone who can teach me how to actually see people, how to build bridges instead of just negotiating contracts. Michael looked at him for a long moment, and Sullivan saw the war happening behind his eyes, fear and hope, grief and possibility, the terrible risk of letting himself want something again. What about Grace? He finally asked. My hours would have to work around her schedule. I'm all she has. We'll make it work. Bring her to the office if you need to. Hell, my daughter Katie could probably use a friend who isn't glued to her phone all day. Sullivan surprised himself with the ease of that accommodation. A week ago, children in the office would have been unthinkable. Now it felt obvious, necessary. "I don't have a college degree," Michael said, but his objections were weakening. Sullivan could hear it. "You have 9 languages and 3 years of living across cultures while dealing with impossible circumstances. You have perspective that can't be taught in classrooms. You have emotional intelligence and resilience, and the ability to connect with people because you've lived and loved and lost and kept going anyway." Sullivan paused, letting the words sink in. "You have exactly what my company needs to grow heart. Real, honest heart that can teach the rest of us how to be better." Michael looked down at his wedding ring, silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Jennifer would have liked this. She always said that the languages were supposed to take us somewhere, that they weren't just about the journey we took together but about wherever I'd go after she was gone. She'd want me to say yes. She'd want Grace to see that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." "Then say yes," Sullivan urged gently. Michael took a shaky breath, then looked up and met Sullivan's eyes directly. "Yes, I'll do it. For Grace, and for Jennifer's memory, and for myself. Because maybe it's time to stop just surviving and start actually living again." They shook hands across the table, and Sullivan felt the calluses on Michael's palm, felt the strength in the grip of someone who'd carried his dying wife to see the Taj Mahal at sunrise, who'd worked 3 jobs to give his daughter opportunities, who'd turned grief into growth. The handshake felt like a covenant, a promise that this was about more than business, it was about becoming better versions of themselves. "When can you start?" Sullivan asked. "I need to give 2 weeks' notice to my other jobs. Do this properly. Leave them in a good position." Even now, even with this opportunity that could change his life, Michael's first thought was doing right by the people who'd employed him. Sullivan felt both humbled and inspired by that integrity. 2 weeks it is. That'll give me time to set up your office, work out the details with HR. Sullivan paused, then added, "And Michael? Thank you. For the languages, for the story, for reminding me that people matter more than profit margins." Michael smiled, genuine and warm despite the tears in his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me. Most people don't, you know. Service workers become invisible pretty quickly." The words landed like a gentle knife in Sullivan's chest because he knew they were true. He'd done it himself for years, looking through people instead of at them, treating human beings like furniture that happened to serve food. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For earlier, for the dismissive way I treated you. You deserved better." "We all do," Michael said, "but we don't always get it. That's why it matters when someone actually sees us, actually tries to do better." He stood, then hesitated. "I should get back to work before someone notices I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. "Take the night off," Sullivan said impulsively. "Go home to Grace. I'll square it with your manager." He pulled out his wallet, extracted $500 in bills. "For your service tonight and for the education." Michael started to protest, but Sullivan pressed the money into his hand. "Please, let me do this. You've given me something more valuable than you know." After Michael left, Sullivan sat alone in the booth, his untouched whiskey still sweating condensation onto the marble table. The restaurant continued its quiet hum around him, but he felt fundamentally changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. He'd come here angry and defeated, and he was leaving humbled and hopeful. He thought about Michael's 9 languages, each one a love letter to a dying woman. Thought about the 3 years they'd had together, cramming a lifetime of experiences into the space between diagnosis and death. Thought about Grace, 7 years old and learning about the world through her father's stories and her mother's legacy. And he thought about himself 42 years old, successful by every conventional measure, and utterly bankrupt in the things that actually mattered. He had money but not connection. He had power but not purpose. He had success but not significance. That was about to change. 3 months passed like water finding new channels. Sullivan kept his promise, and Michael started work as Director of Cultural Relations, a title they'd created specifically for him because his role didn't fit any existing corporate category. The first few weeks were awkward. Michael showed up in the same careful way he'd approached everything else in his life, prepared to work hard, uncertain of his place, quietly competent but expecting to be overlooked. The other employees didn't know what to make of him initially. A former waiter with no college degree suddenly elevated to a director-level position. Some assumed nepotism, others suspected scandal. Most simply waited to see if he'd crash and burn. Michael heard the whispers but didn't respond to them, just kept showing up and doing the work. Sullivan watched him navigate the corporate culture with the same careful attention he'd probably used to navigate foreign countries, observing, learning, adapting without losing his essential self. Michael brought humanity to every interaction in ways that were initially almost jarring to people unused to being treated like full human beings at work. He remembered names, asked about families, noticed when someone was having a bad day and checked in without making it weird. He brought in Grace's school photographs and put them on his desk where everyone could see them. He talked openly about being a widower, about learning languages through grief, about working 3 jobs before this one. He made his story accessible in ways that invited connection instead of pity. And slowly, the office culture began to shift. Sullivan threw himself into learning from Michael with the same intensity he'd once devoted to market analysis. They met daily, sometimes for hours, talking through not just language but cultural context. Michael taught him about the concept of wa in Japanese business culture harmony, the importance of group consensus and face-saving, explained why his direct American presentation style had probably felt aggressive to Tanaka, why the numbers alone hadn't been enough. In Japan, business relationships are built on trust that develops over time. Michael explained one afternoon, sitting in Sullivan's corner office that now felt less like a power statement and more like a classroom. You tried to sell Tanaka on projections and data, but he needed to know you first. Needed to feel like you understood his company's values, his cultural context, his concerns beyond just profit. Sullivan had listened, learning, unlearning, relearning how to see the world through less American-centric eyes. It was humbling work, this recognition of his own limitations. But Michael made the learning feel like possibility rather than failure. They started preparing for a second approach to Tanaka Corporation. This time, Sullivan insisted on going to Tokyo rather than asking Tanaka to come to New York. This time, he studied not just the business proposal but Japanese corporate culture, learning about gift-giving protocols and business card exchange etiquette and the subtle art of reading what wasn't being said. Michael coached him through it all, with patience and precision. "It's not about being fake or manipulative," he said when Sullivan worried about authenticity. "It's about showing respect for their way of doing things. You're entering their cultural space, the least you can do is try to speak their language, literally and figuratively." The trip to Tokyo was Sullivan's education in humility. With Michael beside him, he navigated meetings he would have botched on his own. Michael didn't just translate, he provided context, explained subtleties, helped Sullivan understand the unspoken communication happening alongside the formal presentations. When Tanaka's team responded to something with polite silence, Michael leaned over and whispered, "That's hesitation. They're concerned about the implementation timeline but don't want to say so directly. Ask open-ended questions about their concerns regarding the schedule." Sullivan did, and the conversation shifted. Suddenly they were partners, solving a problem together rather than adversaries negotiating a deal. The difference was subtle but transformative. The deal closed 2 weeks later not for $12 million, but for 18. Tanaka had been so impressed by Sullivan's willingness to adapt, to learn, to meet them in their cultural space, that they'd expanded the scope of the partnership. "You showed respect," Tanaka told Sullivan through Michael's translation at the signing dinner. "Many American businessmen come with confidence but no humility. You came with both. That matters more than numbers." Back in New York, Sullivan stood in front of his team and did something he'd never done before. He gave someone else credit for his success. This deal happened because Michael taught me to actually listen, to see people instead of just profit margins, to value relationships over transactions. He showed me that my greatest weakness wasn't lack of information, but lack of perspective. The office culture continued to evolve. Michael started teaching voluntary lunchtime classes, not just languages, though he offered those too, but sessions on cultural competency, emotional intelligence, the art of genuine connection. Sullivan expected maybe 5 or 10 people to show up. Instead, the conference room filled with 40 employees hungry for something they hadn't known they were missing. Michael taught them about the concept of Ubuntu from South African philosophy, I am because we are. The understanding that individual success is meaningless without community. He taught them about hygge from Danish culture, the art of creating intimacy and contentment in everyday moments. He taught them that business didn't have to feel like warfare, that success could be measured in relationships built rather than competitors destroyed. And slowly, beautifully, the company transformed. Profit margins actually improved as employee retention went up and creativity flourished in an environment where people felt valued. New partnerships developed in Brazil, Germany, Spain, each one approached with cultural sensitivity and genuine relationship building rather than just transactional negotiation. Sullivan watched it happen with wonder and no small amount of shame for the years he'd wasted being the kind of leader who valued dominance over connection. He tried to emulate Michael's approach in his own management style, with mixed success at first. Old habits died hard, and Sullivan sometimes caught himself falling back into autocratic patterns. But Michael was patient with him, gently redirecting when Sullivan fell back into old patterns, celebrating small victories when he managed to lead with humility rather than authority. "You're learning," Michael told him after Sullivan successfully navigated a difficult conversation with a struggling employee. "Jennifer used to tell me that growth happens in inches, not miles. Every small step matters." The personal transformation extended beyond work. Sullivan had reconnected with his daughter Katie, inspired by Michael's devotion to Grace. He'd realized with shame that he'd been almost absent from her life despite living in the same house. Present physically but missing emotionally. Always thinking about work. Always prioritizing the next deal over the person in front of him. He started showing up differently. Attended Katie's art show at school and really looked at her work, a wire sculpture titled Almost, depicting 2 figures reaching for each other but not quite touching, the space between them electric with longing and loss. He'd stood there and cried, seeing in that sculpture his entire relationship with his daughter, all the ways he'd been almost there but never quite connecting. "I'm sorry," he'd told Katie later, the words inadequate but necessary. "I've been almost your dad for 15 years. I want to actually be your dad now, if you'll let me." Katie had looked at him with her mother's eyes. Sullivan's ex-wife, Sarah, had left years ago, tired of being married to a man who loved his work more than his family, and said, "Okay, but you have to mean it. I'm done with Almost." "I mean it," Sullivan promised, and for the first time in years, he actually did. Now, a year after that first night at the Riverside Grill, Sullivan stood at a podium in his company's newly renovated event space, looking out at the assembled crowd. Partners had flown in from Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and Berlin, each expansion approached with Michael's guidance, each market treated as a culture to understand rather than territory to conquer. Michael sat in the front row, Grace beside him in a new dress she'd picked out specifically for tonight. At 7 years old, she was small for her age but fierce in ways that reminded Sullivan of her father's quiet strength. Katie sat next to them, and Sullivan felt his heart swell watching his daughter lean over to whisper something that made Grace giggle. "A year ago," Sullivan began, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who'd learned to wield power with purpose, "I offered a waiter $100,000 to serve me in Japanese. It was meant as a bitter joke, a way to lash out at my own inadequacy after losing a major deal." He paused, meeting Michael's eyes. "That waiter spoke perfect Japanese, and Italian, and French, Portuguese, German, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and Hindi. 9 languages learned while traveling the world with his dying wife, keeping a promise to show her everything she'd dreamed of seeing. Sullivan's voice grew thick with emotion, but he pushed through. Michael Carter taught me that success isn't about being the smartest or richest person in the room. It's about building bridges, creating connections, showing up with humility and genuine desire to understand. He taught me that people aren't means to an end, but ends in themselves. That relationships matter more than transactions. That love, real, selfless, transformative love, is the only thing that actually lasts. He raised his glass, and the room followed suit. To Michael, who speaks 9 languages but taught me the most important one, the language of actual human connection. Thank you for seeing past my arrogance to whatever potential was worth developing. Thank you for showing me what it means to lead with heart. The applause was genuine, heartfelt. Michael stood briefly to acknowledge it, his face flushed with emotion and embarrassment at being the center of attention. Grace clapped loudly, pride radiating from her small frame, and Katie joined in with equal enthusiasm. After the formal speeches ended, after the networking and congratulations and business card exchanges, Sullivan found himself on the building's rooftop terrace with Michael. It had become their habit for processing big moments up here above the city, away from the noise and expectations, just 2 men trying to figure out how to be better than they were yesterday. Jennifer would have loved this, Michael said softly, his eyes on the city lights spreading below them like grounded stars. Not just the success, but what it represents. Building bridges, connecting people. She always said that every person we met was teaching us something, if we were humble enough to learn. She was wise. Sullivan's voice was quiet with respect for a woman he'd never met but felt he knew through her husband's stories and the legacy she'd left in her daughter. I think I would have liked her. She would have liked you too, eventually. Michael's smile was mischievous. After giving you a hard time about your attitude. She didn't tolerate arrogance well, but she loved people who were willing to grow. She'd say you were teachable, which was her highest compliment. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of easy quiet that only developed between people who'd been through something transformative together. Sullivan thought about the journey of the past year, the learning and unlearning, the small victories and humbling failures, the slow work of becoming someone different. I have something to show you, Michael said suddenly. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then handed it to Sullivan. I found this last week. It's a letter Jennifer wrote to Grace before she died, but she wrote one for me too. I'd forgotten about it, honestly. Had it stored away with her other things. But Grace found it while looking for something else, and it felt like the right time to read it. Sullivan looked at the screen. It showed a photograph of handwritten pages, the script slightly shaky but still clearly legible. The letter began, My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you, how to say goodbye to someone who made every day of the last 16 years feel like a gift. But maybe goodbye is the wrong word. Maybe I'm just saying thank you. Thank you for loving me through the bad parts and the good parts and all the parts in between. Thank you for learning Japanese because I wanted to see cherry blossoms. Thank you for Italy and France and Brazil and all the other places you carried me when I couldn't walk on my own anymore. But mostly, thank you for understanding what I needed. Not more time, though God knows I wanted that, but better time. You gave me that. You gave me 3 years of actually living instead of just surviving. You made every day count, even the ones where I couldn't leave our room, even the ones where I was too sick to do more than hold your hand. I need you to promise me something, Michael. Promise me you won't stop here. Promise me you won't let grief make you small. You have 9 languages now, 9 ways of seeing the world, 9 bridges to places and people and possibilities. Use them, not just for translation work or making ends meet, but for something big, something that matters. Those languages, they're not just skills you learned. They're proof of what's possible when love asks us to grow, when commitment pushes us beyond what we think we can do. You learned them for me, but they belong to you now. They belong to your future, whatever that looks like. And Grace. Oh, Michael, our beautiful Grace. Make sure she knows that love isn't about how long you have someone, but about how fully you show up for the time you get. We got 16 years together, and I'd have loved 60, but I wouldn't trade our 3 years of traveling for 30 years of playing it safe. Teach her to be brave. Teach her that hard things are worth doing. Teach her that the world is big and beautiful and scary and worth seeing. Teach her the languages if she wants to learn them, but more importantly, teach her the curiosity and courage that made you willing to learn them in the first place. And Michael, let yourself be happy again. I mean it. I know you'll grieve as hard and as long as you need to, but don't let grief become your whole life. Don't let missing me make you forget how to live. When the right opportunities come, take them. When the right people show up, let them in. When Grace needs you to model resilience instead of just survival, I need you to be strong enough to do that. She needs to see that loss doesn't mean the end of everything good. I've loved you since I was 22 years old. I'll love you when I'm gone. That doesn't change. But you have to keep changing, keep growing, keep becoming whoever you're meant to be next. The Michael who learned 9 languages for me needs to become the Michael who uses those languages for something bigger than grief. Make me proud. Make Grace proud. Make yourself proud. And remember, always remember that the best thing we did together wasn't the traveling or the languages or the beautiful places. The best thing was choosing each other, every single day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. I love you. I've loved you. I'll always love you. Thank you for giving me a life worth living, right up until the end. Forever yours, Jennifer. P.S. The languages will take you somewhere. I don't know where, but somewhere good. Trust that. Trust yourself. And when you get there, know that I'm cheering for you. Sullivan read the letter twice, tears streaming down his face openly. He handed the phone back to Michael with shaking hands. That's... Michael. That's beautiful. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever read. She knew, Michael said, his own voice thick with emotion. Somehow she knew that I'd need permission to keep living, to take chances, to let grief transform into something else. She knew I'd try to make myself small out of some misguided loyalty to her memory. He looked at Sullivan. This job, this opportunity you gave me, Jennifer, predicted it. Not specifically, but she knew the languages would lead somewhere. She wanted them to. She wanted her death to be a beginning of something, not just an ending. She got her wish, Sullivan said. You've transformed not just my company, but me, as a person. You've taught me how to connect with people, how to value relationships over profit margins, how to show up fully instead of just going through the motions. That's Jennifer's legacy, too. She made you capable of teaching me those things. Michael nodded slowly. I think you're right. I think everything we went through, the traveling, the languages, learning to live with dying, it all made me able to see what matters. And made me able to help other people see it, too. He smiled, and Sullivan saw both sadness and joy in the expression. Jennifer would have liked you, Robert. She'd have given you hell about being arrogant, but she'd have seen your potential too. She was always good at seeing people's possibilities instead of just their present circumstances. Like her husband, Sullivan pointed out. I learned it from her, Michael admitted. She saw the best in everyone, made people want to live up to her vision of them. I try to do the same thing now, not because I'm naturally that generous, but because she taught me how. They stood together in comfortable silence as city lights flickered on below them. 2 men who'd been strangers a year ago, brought together by arrogance and grace, by loss and learning, by the universal language of human connection. Sullivan thought about Katie's wire sculpture, those 2 figures reaching for each other, the space between them electric with longing. He thought about how he'd finally closed that distance with his daughter, how he showed up now instead of just promising to show up later. Michael had taught him that later wasn't guaranteed, that the only moment you actually had was now. He thought about Michael's 9 languages, each one learned as love letters to a dying woman, each one now being used to build bridges between cultures and people and possibilities. He thought about Jennifer's letter, her wisdom and generosity even in the face of death, her insistence that her husband keep living fully instead of just surviving. And he thought about himself, the man he'd been a year ago, bitter and isolated, and measuring success in dollars rather than relationships. That man felt like a stranger now, still flawed, still learning, still stumbling sometimes, but fundamentally different in ways that mattered. Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and laughed softly. Grace wants to know if she can have 2 slices of cake since it's a special occasion. Tell her yes, Sullivan said immediately. And tell Katie to make sure they get the good stuff from the dessert table. They're going to be wired on sugar, Michael warned. Good. Let them be kids. Sullivan smiled. Bring them both over tomorrow if you want. Katie's been asking when Grace can come to our place. We could order pizza, watch movies, let them build blanket forts in the living room. You'd be okay with that? Michael looked surprised. Your apartment is expensive and sterile and hasn't had a child's laughter in it for years, Sullivan finished. Grace and Katie will do it good. Make it feel like a home instead of just a showcase. Michael's smile was warm. Jennifer used to say that homes were made by the people in them, not the furniture. That the best houses were the ones that showed signs of being lived in messes and toys and proof that real life was happening inside. She was right about that too. Sullivan paused, then added quietly, I'm grateful I got to meet you, Michael. I'm grateful for everything you've taught me. I'm grateful that I was arrogant enough to make that stupid challenge, because it led here. Me too, Michael said simply. And Jennifer would be grateful too. This is exactly what she wanted, for the hard things to lead to beautiful things, for loss to transform into something that helped people. They headed back inside together, back to the party and the people and the beautiful, complicated mess of building something that mattered. Sullivan rejoined the celebration, feeling full in ways that had nothing to do with food or success, full of connection, of purpose, of becoming someone his daughter could be proud of. He watched Katie and Grace together, 7 and 15 years old, but finding common ground in giggles and whispered secrets. Watched Michael talk to partners from Tokyo with easy fluency, building relationships instead of just negotiating deals. Watched his employees, his people, interact with genuine warmth instead of forced politeness. This was what he'd been missing. This was what all his money and power and success had failed to buy. This feeling of being part of something larger than himself, of contributing to something that mattered beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. Later that night, after the party ended and guests dispersed and cleanup crews restored the space to its usual pristine state, Sullivan sat in his corner office alone. The city spread below him, millions of lives intersecting in ways visible and invisible, everyone carrying their own stories of loss and love and survival. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in years. He texted his ex-wife, Sarah. Just 3 words. You were right. She responded almost immediately. About what? Everything, he typed. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out. There was a long pause, then. Katie says you've changed. That you're actually showing up now. I'm glad. Me too, Sullivan wrote. I met someone who taught me what actually matters. Better late than never? Much better late than never, Sarah agreed. I'm proud of you, Robert. Really proud. Sullivan felt tears prick his eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. Thank you. That means more than you know. He set down his phone and pulled out a notebook. Started writing. Not a business plan or strategic projection, but a letter to Katie, to his future self, to anyone who might need to hear it. Success isn't what I thought it was. It's not corner offices or luxury cars or quarterly reports that exceed projections. Success is showing up for people. It's building relationships that matter. It's being humble enough to learn from a waiter who speaks 9 languages because love demanded it. Success is my daughter smiling at me like she believes I'll actually be there this time. It's watching a 7-year-old girl laugh without knowing that her mother died, believing her father would build something beautiful from grief. It's learning to see people as fully human instead of as means to an end. I've been chasing the wrong things for 20 years. I've been measuring success by metrics that don't actually measure anything that matters. I've been building an empire while my relationships crumbled. That ends now. From this point forward, I measure success by connections made, relationships nurtured, people helped, growth achieved, humility practiced, vulnerability honored, love expressed. Michael Carter taught me that. Jennifer Carter, who I never met but who I honor, taught him. And now they've both taught me that the only language that really matters is the language of genuine human connection. Everything else is just noise. Sullivan closed the notebook and looked out at the city, at the millions of lights representing millions of lives. Somewhere out there, Michael was tucking Grace into bed, probably telling her stories about her mother and the places they'd seen. Somewhere out there, Katie was probably texting friends about the boring corporate event she'd attended but secretly feeling proud that her dad was trying. And here, in this office that had once felt like a throne room but now felt like just a room, Robert Sullivan sat with gratitude so profound it hurt. Gratitude for arrogance that had led to humility, for a lost deal that had led to finding what mattered, for a bitter challenge that had revealed a man worth knowing, worth learning from, worth becoming friends with. He thought about Michael's 9 languages, Japanese and Italian and French and all the others, each one a bridge to understanding, each one proof that love could demand growth and growth could create beauty even in grief. Those 9 languages had been love letters to a dying woman, but they'd also become bridges to a better future, not just for Michael but for everyone he touched, for Sullivan, who'd learned to value connection over dominance, for Grace, who'd learned that loss doesn't mean the end of good things, for all the employees who'd discovered that work could feel like community instead of competition. Jennifer had been right in her letter. The languages had taken Michael somewhere. And through Michael, they'd taken Sullivan somewhere too, to a place where success meant something real, where relationships mattered more than transactions, where vulnerability was strength and humility was courage. Sullivan stood and gathered his things, ready to go home. Tomorrow he'd bring Katie and Grace together for pizza and movies. Next week, he had meetings in Sao Paulo that Michael would help him navigate. Next month, they were launching a new initiative about corporate culture and human connection. But tonight, he was just a man who'd learned an important lesson that the greatest wealth was measured not in dollars but in relationships, not in power but in purpose, not in what you accumulated but in who you became along the way. He turned off the lights in his office and headed for the elevator, thinking about 9 languages learned in grief, a waiter who'd seen more of the world than most millionaires, a woman who'd lived more in 3 years than most people did in 80. And he thought about himself finally becoming someone worth being. Not because he was rich or powerful or successful by conventional measures, but because he'd been humble enough to learn from someone the old him would have dismissed without a second glance. That was the real success. That was what mattered. The elevator doors closed, and Sullivan descended from his tower into the city below, into the world of actual human beings living actual human lives. He was ready to meet them there, to build bridges instead of walls, to connect instead of dominate. Michael had taught him that. Jennifer had taught Michael that, and now Sullivan would spend the rest of his life teaching it to anyone humble enough to listen, because that was the language that mattered, the universal grammar of hearts choosing to connect, to understand, to build something beautiful together out of the raw materials of shared humanity. Everything else was just translation,